When it comes to character relations, the most fascinating relationship a story can introduce is perhaps the rival siblings. Whether it be the dynamic relationship of Inuyasha and Seshomaru, Dante and Virgil, or Sasuke and Itachi, fans of any type of fiction are cognizant of the well-established trope of familial feuding. With that being said, it comes to no surprise that my favorite relationship in Avatar is one between Zuko and Azula, and the reason for this affinity is due to the depth in which this relationship is explored and its complexity. In short, Zuko and Azula's childhood experiences can be described as tragic and abusive. They were both pressured with colossal expectations of perfectionism by their father Ozai, grandfather Azulon, and as a result of them being children of the royal family of the Fire Nation. Furthermore, with the discord of Ursula and Ozai's marriage and the discord between their respective families, Zuko and Azula were interjected in an unhealthy environment that was counterproductive for a nourishing upbringing. But before we delve any further into this family feud, I think it is noteworthy to examine the ones who originated it, Zuko and Azula's great-grandfathers Sozin and Roku. Sozin and Roku were the best of friends. However, as they would get older, their friendship would be put to the test as they embarked on their own paths. When Sozin became the Fire Lord, he advocated for the acquisition of power and the further expansion of the Fire Nation. Roku, who later became the Avatar, advocated for the maintenance of balance and peace throughout the four nations. As you can imagine, with both individuals having conflicting ethics, a rift would be placed in between them, resulting in animosity on both sides. And unfortunately, after years of quarrel, Sozin would betray Roku, leading to Roku's death. Therefore, with no one powerful enough to contest his conduct, Sozin led the Fire Nation into a great expansion, leaving the four nations in disarray. But this feud doesn't just end with these friends turned enemies. This dynamic of peace versus power continues on in their bloodlines as their descendants Ozai and Ursa are forced into an arranged marriage by Fire Lord Azulon. Azulon hears a prophecy that if his bloodline were to merge with the bloodline of Roku's, then together a powerful Fire Lord would be born. Hence, this marriage of two families is not based on the foundation of love, but instead, it's set on the foundations of manipulation and power. Now, caught in the crossfires of this blood feud are the children Azula and Zuko, who did not ask for this decadence, but nonetheless are compelled into it to the detriment of their psyche. Through the hostile madhouse created by Ozai and Ursa, but mostly Ozai, a contentious setting is set for the children. One side of the family values power and instilling fear, and on the other side, love and empathy is encouraged. And this duality in standards causes Zuko and Azula to find it difficult to develop an identity, as both sides of their household are in a constant battle of ideology. And that's what makes the dynamic of Zuko and Azula so interesting, is that they both come from the same environment, but because of their discrepancies in how they were raised, they develop in contrasting ways. And this discrepancy between Zuko and Azula is what will be discussed in today's video. Firstly, I want to discuss how characters usually develop. Usually a character falls into one of these three archetypes. The first is the flat character, a character who doesn't develop that much throughout the story, but has a huge influence on the characters around them. Characters that fall under this archetype are usually the main characters such as Aang, Goku from Dragon Ball, and Luffy from One Piece. The second category that a character falls under is a positive developed character, who is faulty at the beginning of the story, but redeems himself to make up for their past mistakes. Characters like this are Zuko, Vegeta from Dragon Ball Z, and Jaime Lannister from Game of Thrones. Lastly, the third category of development that a character can fall under is a negatively developed character, someone who falls from grace. These characters can include Azula, Anakin Skywalker from the Star Wars prequels, and Walter White from Breaking Bad. Now this is important to note, because when we first see Zuko, he is at rock bottom. He is banished from his nation and bears a scar on his face that represents the disapproval of his father and his honor being taken away. Contrary, when we first see Azula, she's put on a pedestal and admired for prodigal talents. Zuko, however, is portrayed as a failure to Ozai, and Azula is portrayed to be the pride of her father. However, both of these self-identifiers are fallacies. Whether or not Azula or Zuko knows it, their beliefs of who they are false and are actually a product of Ozai's manipulation. The first inclination into Zuko's and Azula's relationship and their self-identifiers is when Zuko mentions it to an unconscious Aang at the end of book 1. Zuko states that Azula was born lucky and he was lucky to be born. And that line right there serves as the impetus of their relationship. Moreover, this line also displays Ozai's manipulation tactics. With his displeasure of Zuko, Zuko becomes desperate to regain his father's approval, which leads him to sabotage meaningful relationships. Examples of this self-sabotage is when Zuko betrayed Uncle Iroh and Team Avatar when Azula tempted him with the idea of regaining his honor if he joined her side. Simultaneously, Ozai manipulates Azula as well by giving her positive affirmations only when she performs according to his immoral ethics. This is why Azula reveres power, domination, and the ability to instill fear onto others. It's because in instances when she exhibits those traits is when she feels valued and important. Unfortunately though, this makes Azula latch onto her father for approval, and thus she becomes Ozai's weapon of destruction with unwavering loyalty. In summary, Zuko and Azula are both pawns in Ozai's game of manipulation. He uses their need for approval to pit them against each other and to fulfill his nefarious needs. Although there are numerous scenes that brilliantly touch upon the dynamic of the two siblings, I believe the most important ones are analyzed in these 4 episodes: the Avatar State, Zuko Alone, The Beach, and Susan's Comet Part 3, Into the Inferno. Firstly, the first time we see Zuko and Azula interact is in the episode The Avatar State. In this episode, we for the first time get an inclination of Zuko and Azula's relationship and how it functions. Furthermore, we get to see how the overbearing pressure of their father plays a part in their comportment. For starters, when Azula is practicing her lightning bending, which is an impressive feat for someone so young, she is unsatisfied in her capabilities. When the judges comment on how Azula was a hair off perfection, she is annoyed and she furiously states that being perfect is not sufficient. With this occurrence, we can conclude that on the surface, Azula is an obsessive perfectionist. However, we can further conclude that this obsession to be perfect stems from Azula's fear of being invaluable to her father, just like her mother Ursula and Zuko. From a young age, Azula has witnessed how her father disposed of those he deemed weak. In addition, with Zuko's public humiliation by the hands of his father, we can gather that Azula's commitment to attain perfection stems from her fear of being treated like Zuko. Following, when Azula meets Zuko and Iroh, Azula says that the Fire Lord invites them back home as he regrets banishing Zuko. Upon hearing this news, Zuko is ecstatic, but Iroh is skeptical. Iroh tries to warn Zuko of this possible trap, but instead, Zuko emotionally refutes him and accuses Iroh of being jealous of Ozai. Now this interaction between Zuko and Iroh is significant because we see Ozai's manipulation at play. Zuko is so entangled in Ozai's manipulation that he wholeheartedly rejects a well-needed guidance from the individual that loves him the most. In addition, Zuko's actions show how Ozai's manipulation caused him to be emotionally unstable and oblivious to obvious misleadings. Therefore, Zuko's delusions are fueled by his desperate desire for his father's approval. Luckily, Zuko eventually sees through Azula's ruse and engages her in a fight, but Azula deals with Zuko with ease by mentally distressing him. Azula uses Zuko's past traumas and insecurities against him, resulting in Zuko becoming agitated. In this scene, Azula is calm and calculated, but Zuko is rash and emotional. Therefore, the tide of battle is in Azula's favor and Zuko is defeated. However, thanks to Iroh, Zuko is saved and manages to escape. Ultimately, the key takeaway from this duel of siblings is how the usage of emotional manipulation is utilized to further one's agenda. In this case, we see how Azula was able to easily manipulate Zuko's desire for his father's approval to come back to the Fire Nation. Also, she used Zuko's insecurities to force him to make irrational decisions and throw him off completely. Thus, as a result of Zuko's unresolved emotional damage and childhood traumas, Azula was able to puppet Zuko to her will. Now the next episode that gives us more insight on Zuko and Azula's relationship is Zuko Alone. I remember when I first watched this episode as a kid, I only saw two victims in Zuko and Ursa, but when we were watching this episode, I realized that I had failed to discern the third victim, Azula. Now, in this episode's series of flashbacks, we learn the cornerstones integral to Zuko's upbringing. Those include the overwhelming pressure from his father, the constant teasing from Azula, and the comfort that Zuko's mother Ursa gave him. But what I failed to realize on my first viewing was the neglect of Azula and the conditions that would later stem the rationale behind her callous behavior. See, what I initially remembered from watching this episode as a child distinctly is Ozai's disdain for Zuko, but now as a young adult, I recognize that Ursa's neglect of Azula is what caused her callousness. Let me explain. In the first flashback of this episode, we see Zuko spending time with Ursa, and when Azula sees this, she immediately calls Zuko to play with her as a ruse to humiliate him. However, we must try and comprehend Azula's motive to conduct such a ruse. We must comprehend that as a child, Azula pranks Zuko because she is jealous of the treatment he is receiving from Ursa, and that her erratic tendencies are a cry for similar treatment. Azula cries out to be shown the same affection and love Zuko is shown. However, Ursa fails to interpret Azula's actions this way. Instead, she overcompensates for Zuko's loneliness with her intention. But with her focus on Zuko, she neglects to show her love and affection to Azula. Another scene where this notion is reinforced is when Azula and Zuko demonstrate their firebending to Ozai and the grandfather Azulon. When Azula performs her firebending, Ursa says nothing. But when Zuko falters, Ursa comforts him. This is a blatant showcasing of favoritism and unfair treatment. In Azula's eyes, she cannot comprehend as to why when she does the perceived right thing, she gets no attention from her mother. But when Zuko makes a fool of himself, her mother is quick to be in his corner. Therefore, unfortunately, this neglect on Ursa's behalf compels Azula to be more inclined to her father's more vicious conduct than to her mother's more compassionate nature. In addition, when Ozai inquires his children on the victory of their great-grandfather Sozin, Zuko struggles to answer, but Azula answers right away, which pleases Ozai. Also, Azula's firebending demonstration is also praised by Ozai. He even calls Azula a prodigy and befit to share the same name as his father, Azulon. But it is noteworthy to mention that Ozai's appraisals are not authentic. Ozai does not see Azula as a child he is proud of, but more of an opportunity for his future endeavors. Ozai does not see Azula as an innocent child, but as a pawn to manipulate. This is why he grins when Azula firebends. He is not grinning because of her showcase of talent, but instead is delighted at the idea of her becoming his weapon of destruction. But unfortunately, Azula as a child does not realize the trap she's falling into, and what is worse is that she has no counsel to help her realize this. You see, in the aforementioned instances, Azula is appraised whenever she expresses violence or fighting prowess, and since she is so young, she isn't cognizant of what is truly right or wrong. Therefore, as a result of her father's encouragement and discipline, Azula follows the path of her father. Hence, it's no wonder as to why Azula ends up as vindictive as she does in the show, as her upbringing at the royal palace promotes her to act in such a fashion. But lastly, it is also significant to discuss the burdensome condemnation Azula faced from her mother. Although Ursa did a good job sheltering Zuko, she failed to realize the indoctrination that Azula was undergoing by Ozai. And instead of showing Azula the same compassion and empathy she does with Zuko, Ursa demonizes Azula by saying things such as, "What is wrong with this child?" which can be extremely damaging to a child. Now these words Ursa has claimed cuts Azula so deep that she still deals with those scars later on in her adolescence. These scars dug from Ursa are akin to the ones Ozai gave to Zuko's eye. The only difference is that Azula's scars are not visible. Therefore, by the end of Zuko alone, we gather the emotional adversities both Zuko and Azula had to endure. With a toxic household, these children had developed a warped sense of their identity and self-value. Ozai's manipulation makes Zuko undervalue himself and poisons Azula's mind with immoral affirmations. And on the inverse, Ursa's love for Zuko aids him to be strong enough to withstand his father's abuse, but her neglect of Azula makes her deprived of the love she needs as a child, making her more susceptible to her father's corruption. While the beach episode serves as a comedic slice of life episode that puts the antagonist in an unusual environment, it also serves as a deeper purpose for the characters Zuko and Azula. Firstly, it showcases how incapable Azula and Zuko are at accustoming themselves to a normal lifestyle as a result of their distinct upbringing at the royal palace and in the Fire Nation military. Hence, this episode highlights the notion of Azula and Zuko being robbed of any form of normalcy growing up, that they were incentivized to become soldiers rather than normal children. This notion is evident when Azula is shown to be excessively competitive at a volleyball game, and when she is unable to strike a normal conversation with any of the boys at the party. Likewise, Zuko is having similar troubles, as when he tries to be romantic with Mei, he fails at every attempt and is seen as disingenuous. But lastly, the most imperative part of this episode is when Zuko and Azula are alone at their old beach house and share a rare but intimate moment together. For the first time in this whole series, we finally see Azula genuinely reach out to Zuko with no ulterior motive. When Azula sees Zuko at their beach house, she asks for Zuko to leave with her, as that house harbors miserable memories. And in agreement, Zuko follows her down to the beach. With this shared moment, we see these two truly act like brother and sister, as they both acknowledge their shared traumatic past. Following this scene, Zuko, Azula, Ty Lee, and Mai are gathered around a fire, and Zuko tosses an old portrait of his family in it. This action prompts Ty Lee to ask Zuko as to why he would burn something so precious, which propels Zuko to go on an emotional tirade. Zuko retorts that he harbors no affinity for his family portrait. He further expresses that despite having his father's approval, he still finds himself troubled. And when asked what is causing his trouble, Zuko answers himself. Zuko realized that with the pursuit of his father's praise, he misled himself into a situation where he questions his own morality. He achieved the perceived right thing, which was to kill the Avatar and bring honor to the Fire Lord and Fire Nation. But in doing so, he compromised his own identity. He lost himself at the expense of his father's gratification. And lastly, in the same pursuit, Zuko betrayed his uncle Iroh, the one individual that had unconditional love for him. Similarly, Azula becomes vulnerable as well. Although for a brief moment, in a seemingly unbothered tone, Azula states that her mother saw her as a monster. She smiles and further states that her mother was right. However, this grimace does not hold for long, as she frowns and admits that her mother's judgment of her still agonizes her. This is the first time we see Azula noticeably distressed. Prior to this, she was seen as having an obstinate confidence. But with the reiteration of her mother's words, we can see that Azula is still affected by her childhood anguish, even years after her mother's banishment. Hence, what the beach shows is the unresolved emotional affairs that Azula and Zuko were dealt with in their childhood, and how those affairs would impact Zuko and Azula in their relationship as siblings, relationship with their peers, and relationship with their own self-image. Now, before I deliberate any further into this discussion of sibling rivalry, I do want to address the final provocation that might have led to Azula's imminent downfall. In the episode titled The Boiling Rock, Mai aids Zuko, her lover, in escaping the Fire Nation prison, and as a result, betrays Azula, her perceived best friend. And when asked about her betrayal, Mai responds that her love for Zuko far outweighs her fear of Azula. This remark infuriates Azula, and when she is about to strike Mai, Ty Lee halts her actions and immobilizes Azula. Azula then proceeds to command the guards to imprison her traitors, but the damage is already done. Azula finds herself alone with her mind in distortion. Similarly to the identity crisis Zuko went through at the beach episode, Azula is going through her own crisis as well. Just like Zuko, Azula is realizing the fallacy of her father's ideals. But unlike Zuko, she fails to suppress her father's philosophies and instead doubles down on them. See, Zuko was fortunate enough to have received guidance from his uncle Iroh and mother Ursa to combat Ozai's indoctrination. However, Azula wasn't blessed with such an opportunity. Therefore, with no one truly on her side, Azula finds it difficult to let go of her father's conducts. With Mai's words, she reinforced the notion that love can override corruption, which comes to contradict Azula's upbringing. For her whole life, Azula believed that all she needed was power and a contriving mind to win her favor. And for most of her life, she was right. However, her adopted philosophy is not invulnerable. People can only be scared for so long, and once they have nothing to be scared of, they cannot be controlled. See, the installation of fear onto others was Azula's edge over everyone. No one could best Azula at games of manipulation, and the reason as to why she keeps her insecurities shrouded is so that no one can have an upper hand over her. But like I said before, this philosophy only works when someone has something to fear, and once someone becomes fearless, that philosophy is null. Now, upon the realization of her falsehoods, Azula is tumultuous. For the entirety of the show, Azula has been cunning, calculated, and stoic. However, at the eve of her coronation, she's in utter disarray. And as a result of her descent into madness, she becomes paranoid and suspects virtually everyone in her premises as a possible traitor. Furthermore, Azula's composure further deteriorates once she starts hallucinating images of her mother. In this engagement with her hallucination, Azula lashes out and expresses that her mother always saw her as a monster. Her hallucinations of her mother then confirms to her that her tactics of manipulation are becoming ineffectual. Azula then retorts that she had no other choice, that even her own mother feared her. Then Ursula corrects her by saying that she always loved Azula. Then Azula breaks her mirror and collapses into tears. Now, what is important to note here is that although the scene is played out like a conversation between a mother and daughter, it's not. And instead, this dialogue is simply Azula's inner monologue. In a way, Azula is trying to justify to herself that her callousness was legitimate, and is having difficulty coming to grips with her new reality of that not being true. But who can blame her? Her whole life, she's neglected proper guidance, and the only affirmation she had received were from her malevolent father. So that's why Azula is finding this paradigm shift so difficult. She is slowly realizing that her whole life was a lie, and the people she was told were weak, like her brother, Arrow, and Ursa, were right, and their approval for her father was null and void. But now for the climax, the duel between siblings, the Agni Kai. The key takeaway from this duel is the composure of both characters. Azula is completely controlled by her emotions, and Zuko is the one who is cool, calm, and composed, which is completely opposite to the first meeting. When we first met Azula in the series, she had everything, and Zuko deemed himself a failure. But now, Azula is alone with no one to trust, and Zuko has gained inner peace and allies with Team Avatar. The roles of the two siblings have completely shifted. Now Zuko has the upper hand, and Azula is the one at rock bottom. Now, in an attempt at provoking Azula, Zuko attempts her into using her lightning, basically baiting her to his advantage. And this tactic is smart of Zuko, because he is giving Azula a taste of her own medicine and beating her at her own game of emotional manipulation. Azula then seemingly takes the bait, but in a shameful act, she aims her lightning at Katara, forcing Zuko to take the hit in order to protect the bystander. Azula then maniacally goes after Katara with the intent of disposing her, but with Katara's cunningness, she figures out a way to trap Azula and detain her with shackles. And through the combined effort of Zuko and Katara, the mighty Azula falls from prominence, and Azula is left throwing an uncontrollable tantrum as she finally breaks. Now this story is one of tragedy. Both parties are victims to a harsh upbringing and are products of a hostile environment and heinous manipulation. But where they differ is in support. Although Zuko and Azula were both lost souls, only Zuko had guidance. Zuko had the affection of his mother and the mentorship of his uncle to guide him to a path of redemption. Moreover, Zuko gained a new supportive family in Team Avatar. He gained comrades in Sokka, Aang, and Toph. Also, Katara was there to listen to Zuko's grievances and through her empathy, helped him overcome his insecurities. Thus, Zuko had ample reinforcements to aid in his redemption arc. However, when it comes to Azula, she had no one to confide in. As Hello Future Me brilliantly said in his video, The Psychology of Azula, no one came to Azula's rescue. Azula had no one to confide in, and due to Ursa's negligence towards her, Azula was the one that suffered the most from her father's manipulation. Even in the Avatar comic book, The Search, when Azula finally comes face to face with her mother, Ursa states that she is sorry for not loving Azula enough, and further states that she was mistaken for her condemnations towards Azula, and instead should have been more affectionate and sympathetic. And that's all Azula needed. She just needed some guidance and sympathy. Although Azula held high prestige in the Fire Nation and was very accomplished, she's still just a 14-year-old girl and is just as clueless as anyone her age. And to her misfortune, she was never taught any better. She was never given an opportunity for redemption because no one was around her to promote it. See, what we can learn from the tale of the two siblings Zuko and Azula is how important it is to have someone to be there for you who cherishes your well-being. This is why parents, mentors, and teachers of any discipline are vital to one's upbringing. For instance, if Zuko did not have the guidance of Aro and Ursa and had not received the forgiveness and companionship of Team Avatar, it is highly improbable for Zuko to become the man he is at the end of the series. And if Azula was not neglected by her mother and was to encounter a mentor similar to her uncle Aro, it is very possible that she could have ended up more gentle-natured and would have adopted a more moral comprehension of right and wrong. This message of acts of kindness is prevalent in most shonen anime, whether it be Iruka Sensei expressing his love for Naruto by treating him to Ichiraku ramen, or Shanks gifting his hat to Luffy as an act to showcase his confidence in him. It is always the minor acts of kindness that can alter someone's life for the better. And this concept is what I believe makes Zuko and Azula's relationship so appealing. It's the fact that small but intermittent acts of kindness were the driving force that altered Zuko and Azula's respective destinies. Both hailed from the same family, yet ended up becoming opposites. Therefore, Zuko and Azula's story teaches us a lot about nurture. Zuko, who was nurtured by his mother, desperately wanted the approval of his father, and Azula, who was perversely nurtured by her father, desperately wanted the approval of her mother. Both siblings were victims of a turbulent household. However, only Zuko was fortunate enough to be rescued, and Azula unfortunately was dealt the fate of giving no such opportunity. Hence, what makes this tale of siblings so interesting is knowing that Zuko's heroic rise and Azula's meteoric fall could have been reversed or never have occurred if it wasn't for the way in which they were nurtured.